Right by Them, a Magnus Archives podfic, written by Esperosis and read by Ibis Podfics. Chapter 7, Concern. John stared down at the piece of paper on his desk as if it had personally offended him, and in a way it had. Statement of Carlos Vickery regarding his arachnophobia. The first time he had read through this statement, the off-mention of the silvery worms infesting the building hadn't even earned a second thought. But he knew better now. He wrinkled his nose at the offending document. He had to figure out a way of getting rid of this thing, figuring out how to keep it far away from Martin. Of course, the easiest answer would be to read it, but insist no follow-up then about it. Or say he'd do it himself and then forget. But that wouldn't work at all. Tim and Sasha and Martin had increased their work efforts recently for some reason, insisting they take care of any and all follow-up on statements. He had tried to tell them not to steer them away from following up the actual supernatural statements. Naturally, those were the ones that the three were most interested in. Their peculiarities and actual supernatural aspects likely drew them in, and no matter what John tried, he couldn't coax them away from their investigations. It especially didn't help that John knew Tim was actively looking into the circus, and Sasha was not only trying to help him, but was insatiably curious in her own right, so he couldn't read it, but he couldn't destroy it either. That would be much too suspicious to Elias, who had made it plainly obvious to John he was watching him, monitoring his pet archivist especially closely after his little health scare. So he needed to get this thing out of the way, somewhere normal enough that it would make sense if Elias looked, but secret enough that his friends wouldn't find it. John puzzled over this for a few moments before the obvious solution popped into his mind. John leaned to the side and unlocked the bottom drawer of his desk. There were already quite a few odd papers in there. He generally put the statement on top of the papers and then relocked the drawer. It couldn't be that easy, could it? It was normal to keep papers in your drawer, and the drawer was locked, so even if anyone wanted to snoop in his desk, which they had no reason to, they couldn't get to it. But things had never gone this easily before. Maybe they could have, and John just had a tendency to overthink things all the time. Either way, that was one problem dealt with. Hopefully, this meant Jane Prentice wouldn't even bother attacking the Institute, but John highly doubted that. From her statement, it seemed like she had always had a bone to pick with the eye. Well, that's why he bothered Elias into getting the sprinkler system replaced. John rubbed his temples, trying to relieve any pressure from the nigh constant migraine that had settled into his mind for the past 2 weeks. He could practically feel his brain throb, let out a morbid shell of a laugh as he idly wondered if he'd start growing eyes on the inside of his skull. He thinks he remembered a statement like that, but a man that Jonah had sacrificed to the eye, and it, in all of its awful and incredible power, had infected his organs with eyes that stared up at his mortician. John knew that by the end, he had many more eyes littering his skin than any human person should have. But it was only now he realized that those eyes may have been more than skin deep. John shook the dark thoughts out of his head. There was no use dwelling on it. He had made his choice with eyes wide open this time. This was his decision, his life, and for once, he had some semblance of control over it. If it was a terrible choice, then so be. It was finally his own decision and not some grand manipulation by the web. He grabbed the bottle of painkillers he kept on his desk and poured some out into a shaking palm. He couldn't remember how long it had been since he had last had some, but he figured any liver or kidney damage was the least of his worries at this point. He drank them down with a long sip of Martin's tea. He instantly felt better, more likely from the tea than the painkillers, as they didn't typically work that fast. Tentative knocks rapped on his doorway, and John looked up to see Tim standing there outside of his office, Martin and Sasha nervously glancing between the two of them from their desks. "Hey, old buddy, can we talk for a sec?" Tim asked, his voice light, jovial, and very, very careful. John had a very bad feeling about this conversation. "Sure, Tim," he replied anyway, as he felt himself start to sweat a bit. Tim nodded and silently stepped into his office and shut the door behind him. He turned to face John once again. He smiled much gentler than it usually was, as his eye flickered to the bottle of painkillers for a moment. "So..." Tim drew the word out as he rounded John's desk and leaned on the old wood, practically sitting on it as he looked down at John. "How have you been feeling recently?" John knew saying "I'm fine" or any variation thereof would be pointless. "I've been better." "Working too hard?" Tim hummed. John grimaced and shrugged, not meeting Tim's eyes. "You've seen how I've been working." "Yeah, that's the thing." Tim brought a hand to his chest as he leaned even further down towards John. "I actually have seen how much you're working. It's the same as me and Sasha and Marta. And yet, you look, and I mean this in the most loving way possible, like death warmed over." Gee, thanks. John rolled his eyes as he looked back at Tim. Have you been taking work home? Tim pressed. No. Tim narrowed his eyes. I haven't, John insisted. I haven't been taking any work home, Tim. I'm not sure how much I believe that because genuinely, John, I've seen you spend nights at work while we were in research for days straight. And you didn't look this bad. I can't stress this enough, John. We are genuinely concerned about your health. I know, John looked down. So what's going on, buddy? Tim asked. The words catch in John's throat. He wants to tell him. He wants to keep his friends safe and protected from all of this. He just wants them to be okay. But he knows better than most. The best way to defend yourself against things like this, if you're forced to interact with them, is to know what's going on. It's time, John decides, to start easing his friends into this world, to give them the warnings he wishes he had gotten in the kindest way possible. I've been reading more of the problem statements, John admits. Tim blinks down at him, confused for a moment, before tilting his head and asking, You mean those ones that don't record on the computers? Yes, those. Tim looks even more confused. I don't understand? The statements, John clarified. After I read them. I just felt exhausted, like all the energy had been pulled out of me, and I'm just some empty husk. And when I read them, it's like I'm the statement giver, living through whatever they're describing. I can feel their emotions and their fear, and it's not pleasant, John laughed nervously. Over the course of John's explanation, his face had slowly morphed from confusion to thinly veiled alarm. Seriously? John nodded, and Tim leaned back and let out a breathy laugh. So, reading these spooky statements is like sucking you into them and taking away all your energy. I think so, John replied. So stop reading them? Tim let out another nervous laugh. That seems like the most obvious solution. I can't. John doesn't even attempt to look at Tim. Why not? Tim adjusts himself so he's leaning towards John again, shifting across his desk a little so he's even closer to him. John, if these statements are hurting you, you have to stop reading them. They're real, John spoke quietly. Real? It was John's turn to give a breathy laugh as he looked at Tim's face. You know as well as I do that most of these statements the Institute gets are rubbish. But some, they're real. I think that's why they're taking so much out of me, because they're actual, real, genuine experiences with the supernatural, John explained. That's why I have to keep reading through them. Tim looked at him in surprise. I'm surprised Mr. Skeptic is admitting he thinks that the supernatural actually exists, let alone that you think these statements are real. John gave Tim a bitter smile. I've always believed in the supernatural. I was just scared. Didn't like to think about it. Hoped if I just kept saying it wasn't real, then it would. John laughed as he rested the back of his fingers against his brow. I don't even know what I was thinking. I wasn't. I was just scared. Still am. With these statements, I don't think the whole denial strategy is going to keep working for very much longer. It was so stupid in hindsight. Did John really ever think that just saying that wasn't real, that Mr. Spire was some delusion that he had as a child would work when he knew that his bones said it wasn't, that it was real, all of it? That there were forces far out of John's comprehension. He couldn't even begin to fathom them? It was so stupid in hindsight. The defense mechanism of a child. One that had gotten him into far more trouble than it had got him out of. John, Tim spoke carefully, I'm going to ask you a question, and you feel totally free to not answer, okay? All right. John looked up at Tim. The light of John's office haloed Tim's head, casting his face in soft shadows that only seemed to highlight how tentative and concerned the man looked. He had never seen Tim look like this. He'd seen him smirking as he flirted with anyone that seemed the least bit receptive. Had seen him high off his ass on CO2. He'd seen him tired and in pain from holes riddling his body, John's fault. He'd seen him bitter and enraged as his world crumbled around him, also John's fault. But he'd never seen him so openly worried and concerned. Usually, he tried to keep a smile on his face whenever he was worried about John, likely hoping that the grin would make John feel better. But not right now. Whatever this was, it was serious. Have you ever had an experience with something supernatural? Tim asked, before quickly continuing. And I don't mean you think you saw a ghost on the corner of your eye or some weird noise in the night that you didn't bother trying to figure out if it was or wasn't some pipes. I mean something real, like proper supernatural, like the statements you think are real. Oh, John swallowed hard around the lump in his throat. He looked Tim in the eye and was honest with him. He deserved that much from John at this point. I have. It was a long time ago. Tim sucked in a sharp breath. Right. Is that why? Again, you don't have to answer. Totally understandable if you don't want to talk about it. But I was just... You mentioned not liking to think about it. And I know you said something similar about your arachnophobia. John nodded. Yes, it's... His breast shook a little. They're related. Yeah, right. Yeah, totally cool. Tim nodded as the room lapsed into silence. John stayed motionless in his chair, his eyes dropping to his hands, clasped together in his lap. Tim shifted about nervously his leg bounced against the side and stretched on. John should probably give Tim an out. The conversation had turned much more awkward and personal than Tim likely wanted it to be. He likely just came in to tell John to stop working so much, give him a pat on the shoulder, and then get out. John knew people didn't like dealing with him. Not really. Especially when things got personal, messy. People didn't like remembering that he was a person before he was a monster. "I don't like clowns," Tim finally spoke up. John's eyes instantly locked on Tim's. His eyes widened in surprise as the words sunk in, and Tim gave a strained smile. "I just mean, I get it. I really get it. The shit out there that, if you ever want to talk about, let me know, alright?" "Oh," was all John could manage. Tim had never talked about the circus to him before. About Danny, well, in a way, he supposed that was natural. John was very much, as Tim had put it, Mr. Skeptic. So trying to bring up your evil skin-stealing clown trauma to someone that regularly ripped apart less ludicrous-sounding stories to pieces, John didn't blame Tim for never mentioning it to him. But he was now. It was just the briefest of details, just a hint, really, but he was trusting John with it, trusting him to take him seriously, to connect with him on that level. John had to fight down the mournful and grateful tears that threatened to spill down his cheeks. Instead, he nodded slowly, swallowing it around the lump in his throat, and spoke. John's voice broke, and he cleared his throat before continuing. "Some of the statements have, clowns in them? Send them my way if you could," Tim replied evenly. John studied Tim's face for a moment. He could see the underlayer of anger, the need for answers, but even more than that, revenge. He really didn't want to encourage that, but at the same time, trying to push back against Tim would just push him away. It was important that Tim knew John was with him, that he was on Tim's side. None of the statements would put him in danger. Not yet. "All right," John finally replied, and they both nodded in silent understanding. "Inspire statements?" Tim asked lightly. I managed," John assured him, and Tim nodded, not pressing any further. "We're here for you, John," Tim told him. "Me, Sasha, and Martin. So, if you ever want to talk about it, not just this, but anything, we're here, all right?" Thank you, Tim. Truly." "It's nothing, really." The grin returned to Tim's face as he patted John on the shoulder. "We're going out for drinks tonight, all right?" "I can't," John replied. Tim immediately looked like he wanted to argue, so John quickly added, "I'm taking some pain medication for my, migraine." "Migraine?" Tim asked. The statements." "Jesus, John," Tim sighed. "How long have you had a migraine?" John grimaced and averted his eyes. "John!" Tim leaned down further until their faces were mere inches apart despite John leaning away from him. 2 weeks? Tim stared blankly at him for a moment, the information rolling around his head for a moment as John squirmed slightly under his gaze. Finally, the admission seemed to settle in Tim's mind as he began nodding slowly and silently, his eyes not leaving John for a moment. One moment John was sitting in his office chair, squirming under the scrutinizing gaze of one of his oldest friends. The next, he was upside down and over Tim's shoulder. John barely had the wherewithal to let out an embarrassing yelping sound before Tim began chastising. 2 weeks, John? Tim huffed as he snatched the pain medication from John's desk. "I swear, you're the absolute worst at taking care of yourself. Is self-care even a thing in your vocabulary?" "But put me down!" John began to squirm, but Tim's arm held fast around his thighs. "No can do, boss man." Tim laughed as he opened the door and walked both of them out of his office. John couldn't see the other two of them from this view of the back of Tim's legs on the floor. He certainly heard Martin gasp in surprise, and Sasha immediately burst out laughing. "Tim!" Martin sputtered. "What are you doing?" "It's boss's map time, Marto," Tim cheerfully replied as he patted John's skinny thighs. Martin exclaimed, likely unsure of what to say or how to react. "What's wrong, Marto? Enjoying the view?" John could hear the shit-eating grin in Tim's voice. Martin made some high-pitched noises John never thought the man was capable of, as Sasha's laughter increased to the point John was fairly certain she was crying. John himself was confused for a few moments, before realizing Tim was likely talking about his... "Tim!" John turned bright red in a matter of moments. He began to beat on the back of Tim's thighs and kick his legs even more. Put me down, right now!" John could feel as Tim's shoulder began to jump up and down as the man laughed. All right, we're going to the break room. Calm down, boss man, or I might drop you." Tim began to walk towards the break room, and the words spun around John. He was finally able to see Sasha and Martin. Martin was bright red as he tentatively followed the pair. Sasha was indeed crying, wiping tears off her face and glasses as she desperately tried to rein her laughter under control. Another laugh burst out of her. "Is he hard to carry?" "Squirming-wise, a little. Weight-wise, nah. He weighs like nothing," Tim chuckled. "Seriously, John, you need to put on some weight. You're way too easy to kidnap like this." Only Tim knew. "I'll keep that in mind," John sighed as he finally gave up his struggling, his arms hanging limp and his head resting against Tim's lower back. He didn't hate this as much as he thought he would have. If he had been who he was last time around this point in time, he likely would have been incandescent with rage at this. But honestly, he didn't mind as much as he thought he would. In the first few moments, he was terrified, flashing back to Brecon and Hope as they dragged him kicking and screaming into the heart of the circus. But this was Tim with his strong yet human skin and proportions. The noise and laughter around him wasn't plastic and hollow. They were the hearty, lovely voices of Sasha, the real one. They were the sputtering concern of a Martin that hadn't had those little mannerisms drained out of him yet. Even the heavy gaze of the eye made him feel safe in a perverse way. He was safe. Tim walked them into the break room, and much more delicately than when he picked John up, set him down on the couch. John tried to stand up, but Tim immediately put his hands on his shoulders and pushed him down till he was lying down across the couch. "Snap time! I want that migraine gone before you go out tonight, boss." Tim clicked his tongue. "He has a migraine?" Sasha asked. "For 2 weeks straight, apparently." Tim turned to look at her over his shoulder. Martin gasped slightly. "John! That's really bad. You need to take better care of yourself." John opened his mouth to protest, but immediately deflated. "I know. How did that even happen? Are you taking work home?" Sasha crossed her arms. John began. "I will explain in a sec. First, we need a blanket and a cup of tea stat." Tim cut him off. Sasha saluted him, and Martin seemed to brighten at the direction as both rushed off to get their respective items, returning quickly. Tim puffed up a pillow and helped John sit up slightly as Martin handed him the tea. It tasted heavenly as John felt exhaustion finally began to catch up with him. "We'll wake you up when it's time to leave." Tim ruffled John's hair. John could only bring himself to half-heartedly huff at him. "Get some sleep and feel better, John." Sasha smiled at him. Yeah, take better care of yourself." Martin fidgeted with his fingers as he smiled back as well. "Thank you." John felt his heart swell in his chest as Tim flicked the lights, the trio heading out of the break room quickly and quietly. John didn't even have time to dwell over all his possible mistakes and errors a few moments after he finished basking in Martin's tea. He fell asleep. "How's the head?" Tim asked as he took a sip of his cocktail. "Better, but that might just be the painkillers," John sighed as he nursed his water. He had taken a few more painkillers after he had woken up, so they had all agreed it was probably best he stayed away from any alcohol. "If it gets worse, tell us," Sasha added as she sipped her drink, and John nodded. As soon as they had gotten to the pub, Tim and Sasha rushed to claim a booth and sit next to each other, forcing John and Martin to share a bench. John narrowed his eyes at the pair, but they both smiled at him. The picture of innocence. It was all John needed to confirm the pair did it on purpose. Not that he was complaining. John was quite happy to sit next to Martin. It took a few moments for him to figure out the optimal distance, one where he was as close to Martin as possible without the man being uncomfortable. Now he was free to bask in the man's presence as Martin downed his second drink, his cheeks pink, presumably from the alcohol, but it was a bit early for him to be getting drunk. But even if he did, John would take care of him, just like the countless times Martin had taken care of him. Tim and Sasha stared at each other, their expressions shifting slightly every few seconds in silent conversation. John frowned as he watched them, Martin awkwardly fiddling with his empty glass, his eyes locked downward. "So," Tim finally spoke up, "boss man, I know you're straight and all, but have you ever, been curious about trying to date a guy?" Sasha immediately elbowed Tim in the gut, causing him to grunt. Their silent conversation resumed much more intensely, but all John could focus on was how Martin seemed to freeze as soon as Tim insinuated he was straight. That couldn't stand a moment longer. "I'm not straight," John immediately corrected, his eyes locked on him, even as he watched Martin's reaction at the corner of his eye. Tim and Sasha instantly froze, their eyes wide as Martin seemed to come back to life, his eyes glued to John. "You're not?" Sasha asked. "No." "Oh!" Tim clapped his hands together and grinned. "A fellow bisexual. I will admit, you really had me fooled there I've thought you were straight for like a year." John frowned. "Yes, I'm bisexual, I guess." "You guess?" Tim's smile faltered a bit, and Sasha looked up even more puzzled. John shifted a bit uncomfortably. This sort of sexuality stuff, it wasn't really something he paid attention to or cared about usually. He never really bothered trying to put a name to it. It never mattered. It seemed to matter right now, and John was starting to regret not even attempting to figure it himself out until this moment. John rubbed his non-burnt bird hand. "I like men and women, I suppose. I don't like doing those sorts of things." He grinned. This was also awkward. Tim, however, seemed to realize something. "You're asexual!" Tim blinked at him. "What? Asexual?" Tim tried again. I'm not asexual anything. I don't like sex," John sputtered. "Do you not know what asexuality is?" Martin gently asked from next to him as Tim immediately began sputtering, and Sasha seemed to bite her hand to keep down any laughter threatening to escape. "Evidently not." John sighed as he rubbed the bridge of his nose. It's basically what you described. Martin smiled at him, and John felt his heart flutter. It just means you don't feel attracted to people. John panicked. I still like men and women. I like dating them and kissing them and those sorts of things. Martin blushed, and John felt himself blush as well. You can still be romantically attracted to others. It's just the more, Martin flushed, rather sexual aspects. Oh, John replied, and he felt his head nod. Then that sounds right. Damn it, John, Tim shook his head. Now I feel like a shit friend for not even knowing you weren't straight. We've known each other for years. Tim sighed over dramatically as Sasha gave him a reassuring pat on the shoulder. To be fair, Tim, I don't really think about that sort of stuff very much, so it's not like I mentioned it for you to mess. John replied. Still, Tim whined dramatically. Now I'm realizing how little I actually know about your personal life. Next you're going to be telling me your dad's a race car driver and your mom's a movie star or something. I'm an orphan, John deadpanned. Sasha immediately spat her drink back into her glasses. Tim instantly paled. John managed to keep a straight face for about 2 more seconds before bursting out laughing. Tim clutched his chest as he huffed. Jesus, don't scare me like that, John. I thought you were actually an orphan. I am. John continued to laugh, but your face was pretty funny. The laughter seemed to be enough for Martin and Sasha as they both started to chuckle as John continued to laugh. After a few moments, Tim joined in as well. Well, I'm glad I didn't make a complete ass of myself there. Tim gave a skewed grin, still seeming a bit self-conscious. No, you're all right. I don't remember my dad. From what I've learned of my mom, she was a very bright and happy woman. I'm sure she would have found it funny too. John gave a wistful smile to Tim as foggy memories of his mother's smile came to mind. He wondered what she would have said if she could have seen him. Tim grabbed his cocktail and drained the entire thing in seconds. Well, I'm going to get us another round, and then we're going to play Never Have I Ever and Would You Rather so we can learn things about each other without any more social faux pas fueled heart attacks. Sasha snorted as Tim shaved out of the booth. The great Timothy Stoker, scared of social interaction due to the socially reclusive Jonathan Sims. I've never thought I'd see the day. Tim turned around and flipped Sasha off as he walked backward a few steps before heading to the bar. John smiled into the lip of his glass. This was nice, very nice. He was having fun and getting to see his friends and future husband so happy and carefree. It was just very nice. He should have done this sooner. Should have gone out with them for drinks last time. He should have done a lot of things. But he didn't want tonight to be tinged by regret. He just wanted to enjoy the second chance he had been given. So he did.